Boarding gate humiliation. The airport was bustling with movement and noise. The sound of rolling suitcases echoed through the terminal, mixing with flight announcements and the quiet hum of conversations. Among the sea of travelers stood a woman named Meera. She wore a plain cotton salwar kameez neatly pressed with her hair tied back into a simple braid. She clutched a leather handbag that looked worn but well cared for. There was something soft about her eyes, gentle, kind, but also quietly determined. She wasn't used to flying. In fact, this was only her second time ever on a plane. But this time was different. Her husband, Arian, had insisted she fly first class because she wasn't feeling well lately. He had told her, "You deserve comfort, Meera. Let them pamper you for once." He had booked the ticket himself and handed her the printed itinerary. She remembered him smiling as he placed it into her hand. She had smiled back shyly and told him she didn't need luxury. But Arian had only laughed and said, "Sometimes you do." Meera stood near gate 22, her eyes on the large electronic screen that displayed the word boarding in blinking yellow. She checked her ticket again. Flight 9W370, first class. She felt nervous. She had never been in a lounge with rich people before. Her clothes were simple. Her slippers were not polished, but she had promised Arian she would go through with it. As she approached the boarding queue, she noticed two lines, one for economy class, and one marked priority and first-class passengers only. Meera hesitated. The line was shorter, but it was full of well-dressed people in designer suits and expensive perfumes. She held her breath and walked toward the first-class queue, heart pounding. A young woman in a tight navy blue uniform stood at the counter. Her name tag read, Natasha, and her smile looked more like a performance than kindness. When Meera handed over her ticket, Natasha barely glanced at her before her face tightened. "Ma'am," she said, frowning, "this line is for first-class passengers only." Meera's throat went dry. She looked at the ticket in her hand and softly replied, I have first class. My husband booked it." Natasha took the ticket and scanned it without looking at Meera. Her eyes darted back and forth across the screen. She let out a small, irritated sigh. Then she turned back to Meera with a voice that sounded cold and sharp. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Are you sure this isn't someone else's ticket?" Meera felt her cheeks burn. People behind her started whispering. One man chuckled. Another woman looked her up and down with disgust. Meera wanted to disappear. She knew she didn't look like she belonged here, but the ticket in her hand was real. Her husband had given it to her. Why were they doubting her? "Can you step aside, please?" Natasha said. "You're holding up the line." Meera's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know where to go or what to say. She moved to the side, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest. She could hear the words being said behind her. She probably stole it. Who lets people like that fly first class? Poor thing must be confused. Those words pierced her like knives. She stood there, helpless, wishing Arian was beside her. But he was traveling later that night from another city. She was on her own for now. A few minutes later, Natasha called over another airline staff member, a tall man named Rohit. He wore a blazer and had a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. Natasha whispered something in his ear. Rohit looked over at Meera and then walked toward her with a forced smile. "Ma'am," he said, "can I see your ID, please?" Meera handed over her Aadhaar card. Rohit examined it, then looked at the ticket again. He seemed puzzled. "I'm going to have to make a call," he said, and stepped away, leaving Meera alone once more. She stood in silence, the terminal lights above making her feel exposed. Other passengers continued boarding. Some glanced at her with pity, some with annoyance. No one offered comfort. She suddenly felt very small, like she was shrinking under the weight of judgment. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Arian. "Let me know once you board. Take a deep breath. You'll be fine, my queen." She stared at the words and her hands trembled. She didn't want to worry him. Not yet. She just replied with a heart emoji and kept the pain to herself. Rohit returned after 10 minutes. He looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, We're still verifying this. Can you please wait near that bench over there until we sort this out? Meera nodded quietly and walked toward the bench. She sat down slowly, feeling humiliated, confused, and hurt. Her back was stiff. Her fingers were cold. She had done nothing wrong, and yet it felt like the whole world had decided she didn't belong. On the other side of the airport, in a private terminal, a sleek black car arrived. A man stepped out wearing a simple black shirt and jeans. His hair was slightly messy from the wind. He wore no watch, no jewelry. But his eyes held a calm power. This was Aryan Malik, the billionaire founder of one of the world's most successful tech companies. And also, unknown to many, the majority stakeholder in Skyreach Airlines, the very airline Meera was now being mistreated by. He had just wrapped up a surprise board meeting. He wasn't supposed to fly tonight, but something had told him to change plans. His assistant was surprised when he asked to book the same flight as Meera just an hour later. I have a feeling she might need me, he had said quietly, almost to himself. He opened his phone and checked Meera's message. She had replied, but something felt off. She usually sent voice notes or emojis filled with laughter. This one was silent, cold, just a heart. His expression shifted. He called his assistant. Find out who is managing Gate 22 right now, he said, voice calm but firm. Back near Gate 22, Natasha was laughing with another staff member. Can you believe that woman? She said, rolling her eyes. First class. My foot. Maybe she thought first class meant first to enter. They laughed, unaware that a security camera directly above them was recording everything, and that someone very powerful was already watching. On the bench, Meera pulled out a small packet of homemade snacks she had packed for the flight. She had made them last night with love, thinking she might share them with the cabin crew. Now she didn't feel like eating at all. She felt like crying. Suddenly, a little girl from the economy queue broke away from her mother and walked over to Meera. Auntie, she said sweetly. Are you okay? Meera smiled weakly. I'm fine, dear. The girl looked at the snack packet in Meera's hand. That smells nice. Can I taste one? Meera nodded and handed her one. The girl took a bite and her eyes lit up. This is yummy, she shouted, and her mother quickly rushed over and pulled her away. Don't talk to strangers, the woman snapped, glancing suspiciously at Meera. Meera turned away, hiding her tears. At that moment, her phone buzzed again. Boarding now. Plane's still there. Why aren't you inside yet? This time she couldn't hide it. They said my ticket might be fake. They asked me to wait. I didn't want to worry you. Aryan stared at the message in shock. Then his eyes hardened. He called his assistant again. I want the security footage from Gate 22 in the last 20 minutes and get me the head of staff on duty, right now. Meanwhile, Meera heard footsteps approaching. Rohit had returned, his face suddenly pale. Ma'am, he said, nervously clearing his throat. We may have made a mistake. Meera looked up, confused. There's been a misunderstanding. We're so sorry for the delay. Please come with me. He reached out his hand. Meera stood slowly, heart still pounding. As she walked toward the gate again, passengers in the economy line watched her with curiosity. Some whispered, some pretended not to see. But just as she reached the gate, another voice stopped her. Hold on. What's she doing here again? It was Natasha. She's not allowed inside until the verification is done, Natasha snapped. Rohit turned to her. It's been done. By who? Natasha demanded. And then, a new voice echoed across the terminal. By the man who owns this airline. They all turned toward the voice. Aryan Malik stood there, calm, his eyes fixed on Natasha. He walked forward slowly, every step heavy with unspoken power. Meera stared at him in disbelief. Aryan, she whispered. But Aryan didn't answer yet. His eyes were locked on Natasha, who had suddenly turned pale. Then slowly he turned to Meera and took her hand. Come, my queen, he said softly. Let me take you home. Natasha's knees buckled, and that's when security guards began walking toward her. The quiet storm, behind the smile as the airport staff stared in disbelief. Aryan Malik gently guided Meera past the boarding gate. His hand remained wrapped around hers, firm yet comforting, like an anchor holding her steady through a storm. The murmurs from the passengers faded into silence as they watched this simple woman, who had just been mocked and humiliated, walk hand in hand with the man who had just revealed himself as the owner of the airline. Meera didn't say anything at first. Her heart was racing, not from excitement but from a deep confusion and a mix of emotions she couldn't name. Her husband had never told her about his ownership of the airline. He had always spoken so simply, lived so quietly. He cooked with her, made her tea when she was tired, tied her shoelaces when her knees hurt. He had never once shown a glimpse of wealth in the way the world defined it. As they stepped into the private lounge behind the gate, the noise of the terminal dimmed. Soft lighting, leather seats, and warm coffee aroma filled the space. Aryan led her to a corner seat and sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Meera turned to him slowly, her eyes searching his face. "You own the airline?" Her voice trembled, not from anger, but from disbelief. Aryan nodded gently. "I do. Not all of it, but enough to make decisions that matter." Meera looked away, processing his words. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aryan reached out, brushing her hand softly. "Because I never wanted you to see me as someone powerful. I wanted to be the man who brings you water when you're thirsty, not the man who commands planes to stop. My world is complicated, Meera. You are the only simple thing in it, and that simplicity is what keeps me sane." Tears filled Meera's eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of emotions crashing inside her. She wasn't angry at his secret. She was hurt by the way people had treated her, and how quickly the treatment had changed the moment Aryan had arrived. "They didn't even look at me properly," she whispered, "just because I wasn't dressed like them." Aryan's jaw tightened. There was a storm beneath his calm expression. "And they will answer for that." Just then, his assistant entered the lounge holding a tablet. "Sir, I have the footage," she said. Aryan took the tablet and watched. The video showed everything: Natasha's tone, the laughter, the mockery, the way Rohit looked the other way when the humiliation began. Every second felt heavier than the last. Meera's silence, her lonely figure on the bench, her shaking hands. It was all there. Aryan watched without blinking. He handed the tablet back and said, "Prepare a report. I want disciplinary action taken. And before anything else, a public apology." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. Meera placed a hand on his arm. "Don't punish them because of me, please." He looked at her, his voice soft but firm. "It's not punishment, it's correction. No woman should be made to feel small because of her clothes. No human should be judged by appearances, especially not in my company." She looked into his eyes and saw something deeper than wealth. It was honor, a kind of quiet fire that burned, not for power but for dignity. Meanwhile, outside the lounge, Natasha had been pulled aside by airport security. Rohit stood a few feet away, watching helplessly. He didn't laugh now. Neither did Natasha. They had realized the gravity of their mistake, but it was too late. As Meera sipped the herbal tea served by a polite attendant, she began to calm down. Her body relaxed, but her heart remained unsettled. This experience had shaken something inside her, something deeper than embarrassment. It was the question of worth. Had she really been so invisible before Aryan walked in? Aryan noticed her silence and leaned closer. "I've always known you're strong," he said, "but you don't have to carry pain alone. If someone hurts, you let me stand beside you, not in front of you, just beside you." She nodded slowly, eyes brimming with warmth. "I'm okay now, just tired." He smiled and gently placed her head on his shoulder. "You'll rest soon. The flight is still waiting." "Waiting? We're not late?" He chuckled softly. "Meera, I asked them to delay the flight until I got to you." She looked up at him wide-eyed. "Won't the passengers be angry?" "They'll be fine, they're sitting comfortably. Besides, I think they'll understand once they find out why." Meera shook her head, amazed. "You really are something else." He smiled. You always knew that. You just forgot for a minute. Soon, the boarding was complete. A staff member returned to escort them onto the plane. This time, the crew bowed slightly as they entered, not out of fear but out of sudden respect. Meera stepped inside and saw the luxury of first class for the first time. Wide seats like soft beds, sparkling water offered before takeoff. Gentle, music playing. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was how different everything felt simply because people now knew who she was standing beside. As she sat down and buckled her seatbelt, Meera glanced around. One man gave her a nod. A woman smiled at her politely, but she couldn't forget how they had looked at her just an hour ago. "Do you feel comfortable?" Arian asked. She nodded. "Yes, but my mind, it's still spinning." He took her hand, again. "Let it spin. We'll slow it down together." The plane lifted off the runway with a soft hum. City lights faded beneath them, and clouds rose to meet the night sky. Meera leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, trying to rest, but her mind wandered back to her past. She remembered growing up in a small village. Her father had been a farmer. Her mother sold vegetables. Meera had studied under the light of a single bulb powered by a weak generator. She had worn her sister's old clothes and patched them herself. Luxury had never been part of her dreams, and yet here she was, flying first class, married to a man who could move mountains with a single phone call. She opened her eyes and turned to Arian. "Do your people know about me?" she asked softly. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The people you work with, the board, the investors. Do they know you married a simple woman?" Arian looked at her for a long moment. "Some do, some don't. But that's never mattered to me. You're not simple. You're rare. And rare things don't need explanations." She smiled gently, but her heart still felt uneasy. Suddenly, the plane hit light turbulence. The lights flickered slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened." Meera grabbed the armrest. Arian reached over and held her hand. "It's all right," he whispered. "We're safe." She nodded, but something strange was stirring in her gut, a sense that the day's troubles weren't quite over yet. As the plane steadied, one of the flight attendants approached Arian quietly. "Sir," she whispered, bending close. "There's something you need to know. It's about one of our senior crew members." "What is it?" Arian asked, frowning slightly. The attendant hesitated, her face tense. "He's the one who leaked the passenger list to a media contact. He found out you were on board, and your wife too." Meera sat up straighter. "Media?" Arian's expression darkened. "Who exactly did he tell?" The attendant swallowed. "We're not sure yet. But we believe a reporter is waiting at the arrival gate. They plan to publish a story about her." Meera's heart sank. "What story?" she asked. "They want to write how a poor woman dressed like a maid was dragged through airport security until her billionaire husband stepped in." Meera blinked, stunned. Arian's voice dropped to a calm but powerful whisper. "Tell the pilot to prepare a different arrival protocol, inform ground staff, and find out who's behind this leak." "Yes, sir," the attendant said and rushed off. Meera looked at him. "I don't want to be in the news." "You won't," he said, holding her hand tighter. "I'll protect your name, your dignity, always." She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The world outside had no idea who she really was, and they were about to make her a symbol of shame and spectacle. She wasn't ready for that, but deep down something had started to change. A quiet fire had been lit inside her. She had stayed silent for too long, and now, for the first time, Meera Malik was preparing to speak. Whispers in the clouds. The plane floated steadily through the night sky, surrounded by endless silence above the clouds. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin, lights were dimmed, and most passengers had reclined their seats to rest. Flight attendants moved quietly, offering warm towels and chamomile tea to those still awake. But Meera couldn't sleep. She sat, upright, her eyes fixed on the small window next to her. The stars blinked faintly outside like distant secrets. Her heart was heavy, not because of the physical space she was in, but because of the emotional weight she now carried. She had always believed that being good, staying quiet, and keeping her head down was enough. But tonight had taught her a painful truth. People don't always see kindness. Sometimes they only see clothes, class, and connections. Beside her, Arian rested with his eyes closed. His hand still gently held hers even in sleep. His face looked calm, but she knew what lay beneath. Arian was not just a man of power. He was a man who carried the burdens of others. He had spent his life shielding her from the sharpness of the world. And tonight, he had done it again. But this time, something inside her told her that she couldn't let him fight alone. She turned away from the window and leaned back. Her mind went back to her childhood, to her father's worn hands, calloused from plowing the fields, to her mother's tired eyes as she carried baskets of vegetables through crowded streets. They had taught her to never complain, to smile, even when people overlooked her. But what would they say now, if they knew their daughter had been treated like dirt, only to be lifted because of a man's wealth? A tear slid down her cheek, and then suddenly she heard it. Two voices whispering behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words were too clear to ignore. "So it's true," a man's voice said. "That's the woman, the maid who married Malik." Meera froze. A woman replied. She didn't even look like she owned a toothbrush. Now she's flying in luxury like a queen. The man laughed. Money really can clean up anything. Their laughter faded as they walked back to their seats. Meera's chest tightened, her face flushed with shame and fury. These were not strangers in a marketplace. These were educated, cultured people in a luxury cabin, still capable of cruelty, still eager to tear others down. She looked at Arian again. He was still asleep, unaware. But she couldn't stay still anymore. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her knees trembled slightly, but she took a deep breath. She walked to the small galley area where a flight attendant stood, folding napkins. "Can I borrow a pen and paper?" Meera asked politely. The attendant smiled, not recognizing her yet. "Of course, ma'am." Meera took them and returned to her seat. She sat down and began to write. Not a complaint, not a confession, but a letter to herself. A reminder of everything she had learned tonight. A message that no one else could erase. Dear Meera, you were never small. You were simply quiet. You didn't belong in their world because you never needed to. You are the reason he smiles, the reason he returns home every night. They saw a poor woman. They didn't see the strength in your silence. But now, you will rise. Not because of his name, but because you found your own. She folded the letter and placed it in her handbag. The plane began its descent. A soft chime rang through the cabin and the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." Arian stirred and sat up. He looked at her, sleepy-eyed. "Did you rest, my queen?" She smiled faintly. "No, but I found something better." He didn't ask what. He just looked at her face, and something in her eyes made him sit up straighter. Something had changed. As the plane touched down and slowed along the runway, tension filled the air. Arian's assistant had confirmed that a news crew was waiting at the terminal. Someone had leaked details. They wanted a story, a scandal, a spectacle. Meera looked out the window. The airport lights glowed softly on the tarmac, but she didn't feel fear anymore. Arian turned to her. "I can call the driver. We'll take the side gate. Avoid the cameras." Meera shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Let them see me." He stared at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I won't hide. Not anymore." The plane stopped. The door opened. The flight attendant came forward and whispered, "Sir, we've arranged a private exit. We can escort you now." Meera stood up. "No need," she said. I'll walk out the same way I walked in, just with my head held higher." Arian smiled softly, pride shining in his eyes. He followed her down the aisle. Other passengers turned to look. Some recognized him. A few even stood. But Meera didn't notice. She walked steadily, calmly, until she reached the terminal. There, under the bright glow of flashing cameras, stood a reporter. "Mrs. Malik," she said loudly, shoving a microphone forward. "You were humiliated before takeoff. How does it feel now to be the wife of the man who saved you?" Meera looked directly at the camera. "I was never saved," she said, her voice steady. "I was seen." The reporter blinked, confused. "But, don't you feel lucky?" Meera smiled faintly. "No, I feel human, and that should have been enough." Just then, a young girl from the waiting area rushed forward. Her name was Rima. She had been on the same flight, traveling in economy. She wore simple clothes and held a small backpack. "Auntie," she said breathlessly, "you gave me a snack before boarding, remember?" Meera bent down and smiled. "Yes. Was it tasty?" The girl nodded. "Very, and my mother said I should say sorry for pulling me away. She was just scared." Meera looked at the child's mother. The woman gave her a small nod from afar. Meera stood and whispered to Arian, "Can we give her something?" Arian smiled. "What do you want to give?" Meera reached into her bag and took out the folded letter. She handed it to the girl. "Keep this. Read it when you grow up. It's not a fairy tale. It's just truth." The cameras kept clicking, but none of them captured the depth of what had just happened. They saw a rich man and his wife. They missed the woman reclaiming her power. As they walked out of the terminal, Meera looked at Arian. "Will they still write their story?" she asked. He shrugged. "Probably. They always do." She smiled. "Then let them write it right. I have something to say." He looked at her, curious. "Are you ready to talk?" Meera nodded. "Then let's tell them everything," he said. But just before they reached the car, Arian's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened, and his expression darkened. Meera saw it immediately. "What happened?" she asked. Arian looked at her slowly. "Someone just hacked into the airline system," he said. "They're trying to expose personal records, including yours." Her breath caught, and then he added, "And I think it's someone from inside." The betrayal within the night was thick with silence as the black SUV pulled away from the terminal, its windows tinted to block the flash of cameras that still tried to chase a story. Inside the vehicle, Meera sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the glowing lights of the airport shrinking in the rearview mirror. But her mind wasn't on the cityscape. It was spinning, rewinding the last words Arian had said before stepping into the car. "Someone just hacked into the airline system, and I think it's someone from inside." The words echoed in her ears, cold and sharp like broken glass. For a moment, the glory of standing tall before the media, of being seen and heard, now felt fragile. She had barely reclaimed her dignity before another storm rolled in. Only this one wasn't about clothes or first-class cabins. It was about safety, about privacy, and about trust. Arian sat beside her, scrolling through messages on his second phone, his expression unreadable. He wasn't panicking. Arian Malik never panicked. But she could feel the tension in his posture, the silent urgency in the way he tapped the screen and read each message twice. "Do you know who did it?" she finally asked, her voice soft but steady. He paused, then looked up. "Not yet, but I've narrowed it down to 3 people, all employees, all with access to sensitive internal data." Meera frowned. "Why would someone from your own company do this?" Arian leaned back, folding his arms. "Power makes enemies, but kindness confuses them even more. People like me aren't supposed to marry people like you, Meera. They want to punish that choice, humiliate it, make it look like a mistake." She nodded slowly, her heart sinking deeper. "So this is my fault?" "No," he said firmly. "Never. This is their sickness, not your sin." His words gave her comfort, but only briefly, because in her heart she couldn't stop wondering. Who had decided she didn't deserve love like this? Who wanted to strip her of it so badly they would hack into a system, leak her identity, and hand her over to a media circus? When they reached home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The staff had already retired for the night, and the halls echoed only with the soft click of their footsteps on the marble floor. Meera paused at the base of the stairs. She looked up at the giant painting that hung above the hallway. It was a modern art piece Arian had bought long ago. A swirl of color and chaos, beautiful and wild. She had never understood it before. But now, standing here after everything, she finally did. "I don't want to be a question mark anymore," she whispered. Arian turned to her. "What do you mean?" "I don't want people guessing why you chose me. I don't want to hide behind tinted glass. I want to speak. To tell my story, on my terms." He studied her, a quiet smile forming on his lips. "You're not a question mark, Meera. You're the answer." He took her hand and led her upstairs. In the morning, Arian called an emergency board meeting. His team gathered inside a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. The tension in the room was heavy. Arian stood at the head of the long, glass table, his voice calm but firm. "Someone from this room has leaked private records," he began. "This is not just a betrayal of policy, it's a betrayal of trust, and I will find out who it is." The room remained silent. One by one, he went through each of the 3 suspects. There was Karen, the cybersecurity officer, Priya, the head of internal communications, and Daniel, a senior marketing executive who had once joked, far too loudly, that Arian's marriage had lowered the brand image. Arian had not laughed then, and he didn't smile now. "We've already begun digital tracing," he said. "Whoever touched the files will be identified." Priya raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, if I may, wouldn't it be better to handle this quietly? The press is already circling. Another scandal, internal betrayal, could harm the airline's reputation." Arian looked at her with eyes as cold as winter. "What harms our reputation," he said slowly, "is tolerating snakes while pretending the garden is clean." No one spoke after that. As Arian laid out the consequences for corporate sabotage, Meera sat in a smaller room nearby. She had asked to come to the office with him, not to eavesdrop, just to be present, to feel that she was no longer hiding in the shadows of her own story. One of the assistants had offered her tea and pastries. She politely declined. Instead, she sat with a notebook in her lap, writing. She was drafting her speech. Yes, a speech, because Meera Malik had decided to speak publicly, not to defend her husband, not to clear her name, but to tell the world who she truly was, and to remind every woman watching that they were never small just because someone else said so. She had thought long and hard about it all night. She wasn't doing this for revenge. She was doing this for every maid, teacher, homemaker, and street vendor who had ever been told they didn't belong. Suddenly, Arian's assistant entered the room. "Ma'am," she said, clearly nervous, "we've found the source of the leak." Meera stood. "Who?" The assistant looked down. "It's Daniel." Meera's eyebrows rose. "The one who mocked me at the gala last year?" "Yes, ma'am. We've pulled the messages. He sent your full profile to a media blog known for personal attacks. They were preparing a hit piece until your public appearance changed the narrative." Meera was silent for a long moment. "What will happen to him?" "Mr. Malik has called him in. Now." Meera nodded. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom, Daniel sat with forced confidence as Arian placed printed messages in front of him. Messages filled with mocking words, data transfers, and timestamps. There was no way out now. "I trusted you," Arian said quietly. "And you used your access to attack my wife." Daniel scoffed. "You brought this on yourself. You act like your love story makes you noble. But this isn't a fairy tale. Your wife doesn't fit the image. You're risking our brand." Arian's face didn't change, but his voice did. It dropped lower, colder. "Then let me be very clear," he said. I would burn this brand to the ground before I let someone treat her like she doesn't belong. He stood. You're fired. Effective immediately. And we're pursuing legal action. Security entered quietly. As Daniel was escorted out, he passed by the room where Meera stood. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Daniel looked away first. Later that day, Arian held a press conference. It was small, selective, only a few reputable outlets invited. Meera stood behind the curtain waiting. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage. The cameras clicked. Lights flashed. But this time, she wasn't shaking. I'm not here to defend my husband, she began. I'm here to speak for myself. She paused. The room was silent. I am Meera Malik. Before I was his wife, I was my father's daughter, my mother's hope, my village's pride. I've been poor. I've been mocked. But I've never been weak. She looked directly into the lenses of the cameras. I was denied a seat on a plane because of how I looked. Then I was given a seat because of who I married. Both were wrong. I deserved that seat because I had a ticket. Nothing more, nothing less. A slow clap began. It spread. Tears filled a few eyes. And deep in the audience, one reporter stood and asked, "What do you say to the people who still think you don't belong?" Meera smiled gently. "Then let them watch what I build next." But just as she stepped down, Arian's assistant rushed to him, whispering something that changed his expression instantly. Meera saw it. "What now?" she asked. He turned to her, slowly. "The media blog that received your data, they've already sold it." Her heart stopped. "To who?" He looked at her, his voice heavy. "To a political group. They want to use your story for a smear campaign. They're going to paint you as a fraud." Meera's knees weakened, and then he said something even worse. "And they're claiming you were never legally married to me." The marriage they tried to erase. The afternoon sun had begun to fade behind the glass walls of the press room, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The warmth in the room had been replaced by a sudden chill, the kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning, but from betrayal. Meera stood frozen, her fingers clenched at her sides, trying to process the words Arian had just whispered. "They're claiming you were never legally married to me." The words were absurd, but they felt real. Too real. And in that moment, she saw it. Not just as a cruel lie, but as the next chapter in a campaign to tear her down. She stared at Arian, searching his face for reassurance. "But we are married," she said softly, almost like a question. "We have the certificate, the photos, the vows." Arian nodded, his jaw tight. "We do. But the people behind this aren't interested in the truth. They're interested in creating doubt." He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "They've filed a request under the Right to Information Act, claiming our marriage certificate is forged. And they've approached a former registrar with bribes. They want him to say he never signed it." Meera felt like the ground beneath her was shifting again. She had just started to breathe freely, to believe she could rise above the ridicule, the headlines, the stares. And now, they were trying to erase her entirely. Not just from society, but from her own story. "Why?" she whispered. Arian placed a hand gently on her cheek. "Because your strength scares them more than your silence ever did." The press had not heard what was said behind the curtain. The cameras were off for now, but in a few hours, this news would spread. The blogs, the tabloids, the opinion columns, they would all have a field day. And no matter how baseless the accusation, some people would believe it. Some would whisper, maybe she really did fake it. Back at their home that evening, the atmosphere was heavier than before. The silence was not peaceful. It was filled with the weight of a storm approaching. Meera sat in the courtyard staring at a small clay dia flickering in the gentle breeze. Arian joined her, placing a tray of tea between them. He poured her a cup, the sound of the liquid soothing for a moment. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she replied. "I feel like someone is trying to rip pages out of the book of my life, as if they think they can tear out the chapter where I became your wife." Arian nodded. "And if we let them, they will." Meera looked at him, determination slowly replacing the fear in her eyes. Then we won't let them. He smiled. Good, because we're going to fight this, legally, publicly, and together. The next morning, Arian's legal team filed a formal defamation case. They attached a copy of their original marriage certificate registered 5 years ago. They also included photos from their ceremony. Meera in her pale yellow saree, smiling shyly beside Arian under a tree where they had taken their vows in a private family ceremony. But as expected, the political group behind the smear campaign doubled down. They paid influencers to raise questions. They released edited images, false statements, even deepfake videos. Hashtags began trending. Gold digger wife, your fake marriage, your Malik scandal. The cruelty was relentless. Arian's PR team advised them to lay low, to avoid responding. But Meera refused. They're not just trying to erase my name, she said during a strategy meeting. They're trying to erase my truth. If I stay silent now, I'll be teaching every young girl watching that their dignity depends on someone else's permission. So she made a decision. Meera would give a live interview on the nation's most trusted talk show. With no script, no prep questions, just her heart, her voice, and her truth. On the day of the interview, the studio lights were bright and unforgiving. The host, a seasoned journalist named Kavita Rao, welcomed Meera with grace, but didn't sugarcoat anything. Mrs. Malik, she began, the nation is divided. Some believe you're the victim of classism. Others believe you manipulated your way into one of the most powerful families in India. Tonight, you have a chance to answer. Meera didn't flinch. She looked straight into the camera and spoke. I don't have expensive words. I never learned how to dress for cameras. I didn't grow up dreaming of marrying a billionaire. I grew up hoping my father's crops wouldn't fail. The audience was silent. I met Aryan Malik when he visited our village for a charity event. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing dust-covered sneakers and feeding stray dogs. I didn't know who he was. He didn't know who I was, but we talked and we kept talking. And one day he asked if I'd like to marry him. She paused, her voice steady. I said yes. Not because of money, but because for the first time, someone looked at me and saw more than my worn clothes. He saw my mind, my heart, my dreams. Kavita leaned in. And the certificate? The alleged forgery? Meera reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. This is the notarized, officially validated marriage certificate, signed by the registrar. Here's his sworn statement, here's the guest list, here's our wedding footage. And here, she said, pulling out one final item, is a letter my husband wrote to me the night before our wedding. Handwritten, private, untouched. If anyone still believes our love is fake, let them read this. Kavita didn't say a word. The audience didn't clap. They were stunned into silence. But the silence was no longer cold. It was reverent. After the interview, something strange happened. The hashtags stopped. The online attacks slowed. One by one. People began posting in support of Meera. Women from villages, students, nurses, teachers, even celebrities. They shared their own stories of being told they weren't enough, and they ended their posts with a new hashtag. Meera told the truth. The political group behind the smear campaign was exposed. Their ties to the hacked leak were traced and revealed. The registrar who accepted the bribe confessed. Daniel, the ex-employee, gave a public apology in court under pressure. And still Meera remained calm, composed, not triumphant, just whole. But just as they thought the storm had passed, Aryan received a phone call from an unknown number. He picked it up, listened, frowned. Then slowly, he turned to Meera. There's something you need to hear, he said. He placed the phone on speaker. A deep, gravelly voice spoke. Mrs. Malik, you've been a very brave woman, but bravery has its price. Meera felt her blood run cold. You think the scandals are over? No, this was just the beginning. You want to stand tall? Let's see how tall you stand when we drag your family's secrets into the light. And then the call ended. Meera stared at the phone, her heart pounding. What does he mean? She whispered. Aryan looked at her gently, but his eyes were full of fire. He means they're going after your past now. Her past, her power. The air inside the room turned heavy after the call ended, as if invisible walls were closing in. Meera sat frozen, staring at the phone on the table. Her throat was dry, her hands cold, but her heart burned with a strange, steady fire. It was not fear anymore. It was something stronger, something closer to resolve. Arian leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. "Meera," he said gently, "you don't have to face this alone. Whatever they try to bring up about your past, we will handle it together." She shook her head, not in refusal but with quiet determination. "No, I think I have to face it. Fully. Not just to prove them wrong, but to prove something to myself." That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the balcony with a cup of warm milk wrapped in a soft shawl Arian had placed around her shoulders. Memories came flooding back, uninvited but not unwelcome. Dusty village roads, worn textbooks, the laughter of her younger brother before he fell sick. Her mother's hands, rough from hard work but gentle when they stroked her hair. Her father's, silence heavy with pride and pain. There were things in her past she had kept private, not because they were shameful but because they were sacred. Pieces of her life too personal for headlines, too real for shallow opinions. But now the people trying to destroy her dignity had threatened to twist those memories into weapons. She couldn't allow that. By morning, she had made her decision. Within 2 days, the mysterious voice from the call had delivered on its promise. A fabricated article appeared on a shadowy website, claiming that Meera had once been arrested for theft as a teenager. It showed a blurry photo of a girl who only vaguely resembled her, dressed in ragged clothes, being pulled by a constable. The article claimed she had stolen gold bangles from her neighbor's home. No sources were cited, no real evidence provided. But that didn't matter. In the age of the internet, mud didn't need to be true to leave stains. The article spread quickly through messaging apps, chat groups, and gossip networks. New headlines popped up. Was Meera Malik ever a thief? From slums to Malik's mansion, truth or trick? Arian's legal team filed immediate takedown notices. They began tracking the site's source. And yet, damage had already been done. Meera saw the screenshots flooding in. Even some people from Arian's extended social circle, those who had quietly judged her from day one, were now boldly forwarding the article with smirks. But Meera didn't hide. She didn't retreat. Instead, she recorded a video. Alone. No studio, no lights, no makeup artist. Just her, sitting on the same balcony, the morning sun behind her. She spoke slowly. "This is not a video to defend myself. This is a video to tell the truth before others try to distort it." She reached down and picked up a thin folder. "This," she said, "is my record. Clean, verified, stamped. I've never been arrested, never even received a traffic ticket." She placed it on the table. But what if I'd been arrested? What if I had made a mistake at 15? Would that make me unworthy of love, of change, of growth? I'm asking the people who believe every forwarded message, what is the standard you're holding me to? Perfection? Because no woman should have to be flawless just to deserve respect. She looked directly into the camera. You can't erase my past, because I'm not ashamed of where I come from. I carried water on my head. I studied by kerosene lamp. I watched my brother die because we couldn't afford medicine. If you think poverty is a crime, then yes, I've lived a criminal life. She paused, took a breath. But I won't apologize for surviving. The video went viral. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was emotional, but because it was real. Comments poured in by the millions. Women from cities and villages both wrote, "This is our voice." Young men wrote, "We were raised by women like her." Even politicians who had once stayed silent now began to speak out against the smear campaign. The news channels picked it up. Respected journalists began questioning the shadowy media group. The photo of the so-called arrest was proven fake, edited using AI tools. And finally, the domain owner of the smear site was exposed. It was a relative of one of Arian's competitors, someone who had always resented the idea that a man like Aryan Malik would marry a nobody. They were arrested, but Meera wasn't celebrating revenge. She didn't want heads to roll. She wanted silence, peace, clarity. So Aryan arranged something she had quietly mentioned years ago, something she had never dared dream would actually happen. In her childhood village, a small field had once stood barren for years. It was where her brother used to play before he got sick. There was nothing there but cracked ground and a half-broken swing set. She had once said, "If I ever have enough, I'll turn that place into something beautiful." Now it was happening. A month later, Meera Malik stood in the middle of that same field. Beside her was Aryan, holding a small brass bell. A crowd had gathered. Children, teachers, villagers, journalists. A ribbon hung between two poles. Behind, it stood a newly built school, the Meera Malik Institute for Girls. She didn't speak on stage. She simply rang the bell and walked through the front doors. Her eyes glistened not with fame but with the joy of becoming who she was always meant to be. As the crowd clapped and the press took photos, a young girl from the village stepped forward. "Didi," she asked shyly, "will you teach us too?" Meera knelt and smiled. "I already am." Back in the city, life slowly returned to normal. Aryan resumed work. The airline launched a new initiative offering free first-class upgrades to teachers and social workers. Meera began visiting girls' schools and writing short columns in regional newspapers. She didn't want fame. She wanted purpose. One evening, Aryan came home to find her sitting on the floor with notebooks spread around her. He laughed. "Are you running another school from home?" Meera looked up, grinning. "No, just writing stories for the next textbook." He sat beside her, took her hand. "You know," he said, "when I first saw you in the village, you were sitting on a Sharpei, teaching maths to your cousin using stones." She laughed. "I was using pebbles because we had no paper." "And now?" he asked. She shrugged. "Now I use paper." They both laughed. And for the first time in a long time, the laughter wasn't shadowed by fear or rumors or doubt. It was full. It was free. On the anniversary of her press interview, a media outlet reached out again. They wanted to do a new story, a celebration, a tribute. They asked for a quote. Meera replied with just one line. "I was never trying to prove that I belonged in first class. I was proving that every woman belongs wherever she walks with her head held high." And with that, the story came, full circle. Not the story of a simple woman who married a billionaire, but the story of a powerful woman who found her voice and used it to change the world.